Tonight, we are going to be speaking about the United States in the Middle East and really about what it means to be an expert on the Middle East and the relationship between government and expertise and the academy and government and a lot of other institutions in society. How did the thing called being a Middle East expert change over time? Our guest is Professor Osama Khalil of Syracuse University, who's author of America's Dream Palace, Middle East Expertise and the Rise of the National Security State. So Professor Khalil, welcome, and we'd love to hear about your book.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. So again, I want to thank the John Quincy Adams Society for hosting the event. I want to thank John for the invitation and Patrick for all his help. I'm a fan of the society and its goal of informing the public about foreign policy issues, especially restraint. And as John and Patrick and I happily served as a faculty advisor at Syracuse, and looking forward to the conversation, and hopefully it's a spirited one. So I thought I'd just give an overview of my goals in writing the book and what I think some of the key themes are that emerged in the book. And so the first, as John mentioned, was to offer an institutional and intellectual history of Middle East studies and expertise in the United States. And part of it was also drawing on the British example. And so what I demonstrate in the book was that Middle East studies are not unique or exceptional in the history of area studies or the social sciences. And so I'm sure many of the guests are wondering, why is that important? So what? So what you will find is that there are already a number of works on the shelf that you could pick up about the history of Middle East studies. And then there's also a general notion within academia that Middle East studies and Middle East studies scholars are unique, that quite frankly, they are uniquely anti-American, that they're anti-Israel. And so what I wanted to show was that this field, which is broad and diverse, shared a number of origin points with other area studies, East Asia, Latin America, et cetera. And it also had shared divergent points. And I'll talk a little more about those here and also in the Q&A if those are interested. So the second was to demonstrate the profound influence, as John mentioned, of U.S. national security interests on what we call the production of knowledge about the Middle East and the promotion of expertise. Who is an expert? Who's an expert? Why do they become an expert? What makes them an expert? And so like other area studies, so for example, you would often see this in the discussion about Russian or Soviet studies, often about East Asian studies, but not so much about Middle East studies. This was a driver in the creation of the field. And so one of the things I talk about is how the field itself initially drew on this existing body of knowledge from missionaries, military personnel, oftentimes naval personnel who spent some time in the region, spies who were sent to the region, especially during World War II, and what are known as Orientalist scholars. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so what I wanted to reveal was the close ties and coordination between U.S. government agencies and academic institutions, philanthropic foundations and academic societies, and how they coordinated and collaborated in the creation and expansion of the field. And the goal, as I talk about, was to establish, and especially with the creation of university-based centers after World War II, a firm and reliable basis of expertise that the government and business could draw on. Creating professors, et cetera, was really a secondary goal, if that. But the initial goal, especially as the U.S. Goes into the Cold War, was to create this reliable basis of expertise that can be drawn on and could help train future generations of scholars, but also serve the government in a variety of fields, including on contract research, contract expertise, especially with the intelligence agencies, and of course, the State Department. The third thing I wanted to demonstrate was the profound influence of Orientalist notions and perceptions on policymakers and academics and its relationship to the field. So for those in the audience that are familiar with Edward Said's seminal work, Orientalism, in which he describes Orientalism as a discourse about how the West views and talks about the Eastern other. And so the East being this broad area that covers West Africa all the way to Japan. And so how the East is talked about, this other, is timeless, unchanging, emotional, irrational, unstable. And what Said writes, and others that have picked up on him, is that this also tells us something about how the West views itself. It views itself as the opposite, right? That the West is dynamic, that the West is rational, it is scientific. The West takes action, right? And one of the things Said talks about is that the East, this broad East, became this canvas, not just for how writing about this area, but action in the area, and of course, projecting onto the area, all of these ideas about it. Okay. Now, where this gets separated from me from Said is Said focused largely on British and French imperialism and the role of literature, for example, as a reflection of imperial power and knowledge production. So these classic works of literature that he writes about, and he argues that the British and French had its longest interaction with what their East was, right? So that what we now call the Middle East, the Levant, the Near East, that for the United States was not so much shared with the British and the French. And he only writes about the US in the latter third of the book. And interestingly enough, that latter third of the book deals with area studies. So what I wanted to do with the book was to apply this Saidian approach to policy development and implementation to bring Said really to foreign policy scholarship, and also to look at the expertise that informs policy. So how do I do that? So what the book does, it does it in two ways. The first is this broad construction of this area we now call the Middle East. So many of you in the audience are thinking, well, wasn't it always called that? Well, in fact, no. So the actual term Middle East is coined by an American naval strategist, a man by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan. And Mahan is actually famous in Britain and the British Empire, one for being, his ideas about naval power. He is a key advisor to Teddy Roosevelt over time. But one of the things he's famous about in Britain is the fact that he's considered an impartial naval strategist because he's an American. And so Mahan, in an article about what we now view as Afghanistan, Iran, and really the broader India, because that's really Britain's main interest at the time in 1902, we'll call that the Middle East. Not the area this broader area that we think about, the area around the Persian Gulf, or it's stretching out, even as I talk about in the book, out to North Africa. But what I talk about in the book is that original idea, the British idea of the Middle East that's centered on India and the approaches to India, changes over the course of a century. And those boundaries have changed to reflect the interests first of the British Empire and then the United States. So what was Mahan's Middle East becomes, and the British Near East becomes the Middle East for the United States, right? Excluding India, of course. And here, what I demonstrate in the book is how expertise aligned with national security interests both reflected and reified those changing boundaries. They made them real, right? And this became reproduced over a century, including those changing boundaries. So for the United States, at the height of the Cold War, the Middle East is vast. It covers from Morocco all the way to Pakistan, and then it will shrink. And then it'll expand again, especially by the global war on terror. So these shrinking and changing boundaries, and I talk about the expertise and the interest that aligns with them. Now, the second way I look at the role of Orientalism is really to discuss how Orientalist notions, depictions, and preconceptions inform policymakers. So this I trace out also over the course of the century. So whether it was during the peace talks to end World War I, and how notions of blood purity, manufactured notions of race and ethnicity, informed the peace talks to end World War I and the artificial construction of boundaries, how it informed spies during World War II and what could or could not be done in and around the Middle East and why. It informed the creation of post-war development of intelligence networks. It also is going to play a key role in the Cold War competition with Moscow. Things like modernization theory will be deeply informed by Orientalist scholarship, as I talk about in the book. It will reemerge in the 60s, late 60s and 70s with the Arab-Israeli peace process and the Arab-Israeli conflict and peace process. And then, of course, with the global war on terror, where it plays yet another key role. And I'm happy to talk more about all of that in the Q&A. The fourth goal was also to examine the emergence of think tanks and their growth over several decades and how they supplanted academic expertise. And so here, what I sought to explain was really a conundrum, all right? By the 1970s, the United States had become more deeply involved in the Middle East, directly and indirectly. So that was directly, whether it was through the peace process negotiations, whether it was through the support of a number of different regimes and governments in the Middle East, and then, of course, through weapons sales. And at the same time, funding for area studies decreased. And so what we start to see in the 1970s is the beginning of greater involvement of think tanks in foreign policy affairs. And this starts, of course, with the Soviet Union, which you would expect, but less expected was how one of the major think tanks, and in the 1970s, there were only a few, and this was the Brookings Institution, gets heavily involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict and peace process, and of course, starts to set a template for other think tanks because of its role in serving the Carter administration. And so one of the things the book demonstrates is that think tanks predominated in the late and post-Cold War eras because of their alignment with state interests. And at the same time, following the Vietnam War and the rise of what's known as the New Left in academia, university-based scholars were both more suspicious of government agencies and U.S. foreign policy interests, of course, drawing on the Vietnam experience and the campus protest movement, but they were also viewed with skepticism by the U.S. government. And again, not all of them, but this became particularly pronounced in area studies, especially Middle East studies. So one of the things the book does is it follows this arc of privately held knowledge of missionaries and Orientalist scholars whose knowledge was adapted, this privately held knowledge that they had, was adapted for government use before U.S. hegemony in the region and before the rise of the post-war university, what becomes known as the Cold War University, and to the private, and it tracks out to the privatized knowledge of think tanks aligned with the government by the global war on terror. Okay. And so the final goal was embodied in the dream palace of the title. And so for those who aren't familiar, that was adapted from a quote by T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia. And one of the things that Lawrence is going to write in his classic book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, is that he helped bring what he called the dream palace of nationalism to the Arabs. And so what I wanted to do was kind of take that idea and say, and demonstrate that what the real dream palace was actually this area we now call the Middle East. That not only was it constructed by national security interests, first British and then American, but that it also is a reflection of attempts to reshape the region in America's image. And the vehicle for reshaping it was Lawrence and his manufactured legacy. So especially the manufactured legacy that's embodied in this book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, where that quote appears, and which inspired generations of American men and women to follow in his footsteps. So as I discussed in the book, Lawrence becomes a key cultural touch point for national security experts that attempt to reshape the Middle East during World War II, the Cold War, and the War on Terror. So I'll end there, and thanks again for the invitation, and I'm happy to entertain some questions.
Absolutely. And for those of you in the audience, the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, feel free to drop questions in there or upvote others' questions. I'll be keeping an eye on that. But I'm curious about, you trace this kind of emergence of think tanks, and I'm a former think tanker myself, so it's very interesting to me. And one of the interesting questions is out there is like how the role of think tanks seems to maybe be changing a little bit. That, for instance, the Obama administration, in Jeffrey Goldberg's famous interview of Obama, part of the notes in the article, he talks about how a senior official had referred to Massachusetts Avenue, where a lot of the big think tanks are, as Arab-occupied territory, and suggested this was widely held as a view within the White House, that these institutions receive a lot of funding from Middle Eastern countries, especially like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and that they were taking positions that were critical of the administration and aligned with the interests of those countries. And similarly during the Trump administration, I remember watching all these fights where you could kind of see who was getting money from Qatar versus who was getting money from the UAE and Saudi, because these institutions were fighting each other about this diplomatic crisis between the Saudis and Emiratis on the one side and the Qataris and Turks on the other. So I'm curious, has this space changed? Was this always kind of a trend that was there? Is this kind of subordinate to this broader pattern of these institutions are aligned with American national security interests?
So I think it's a great question. And so, one of the challenges in writing the book was, of course, that's a second arc that developed. So, let me step back here. This is where when we think about where did the name think tank comes from, and it emerges out of World War II, right? This was a military term. It was supposed to be a term for a secure room where planning took place. And so really what you see is there's only a few think tanks, in Washington, from basically the 40s, almost all the way to the 70s. So who are those think tanks? So Rand, which is based out of Santa Monica and has close ties, of course, not just to aerospace, but to the U.S. military, was one of the granddaddies of the think tank world. The second one was Brookings that I mentioned earlier, but Brookings focused mostly on domestic politics, right? That was their bread and butter. They start to venture into, and it's mostly when they venture into foreign policy in the 60s and then just beginning of the 70s is related to the Soviet Union. Rand is focused heavily on strategic planning, as you can imagine, especially around nuclear weapons, around strategic air command. And then, of course, as we all know, most famously with what becomes known as the Pentagon Papers study, right? The study of Vietnam. But it's just, part of this very broad group of research that Rand is doing. One thing that is consistent, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. So there's another think tank that didn't call itself that, right, in 1947 that's founded, and that's the Middle East Institute, right, the granddaddy of Middle East think tanks. It doesn't take that think tank name on until the 90s. It was just a research institute, if it was that, right? So they didn't call themselves a think tank for a long time. And so what's interesting is when you start to trace out the role of kind of government involvement, a place like Middle East Institute got funding from the major oil companies and State Department and likely a couple of other government agencies. But they wouldn't broadcast that, right? And in fact, there wasn't a lot of pressure on who were the donors for decades. No one asked, right? Rand was very clear. Its business was with the U.S. government, but it was supposed to provide non-partial, as it said, or impartial expertise. Brookings, again, focused heavily on domestic politics, a lot of stuff on tax policy. And so one of the things that's going to start to change, John, in answer to your question, is how do think tanks, and this is one way for the audience to think about it, how did you measure your influence? Well, you measured your influence by, did you testify before Congress? Did you help promote legislation? Did you get a job within a particular administration, particularly if it was something related to the wonders of tax policy, healthcare policy, all those things where, quite frankly, that was their bread and butter. Did you publish op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post? Over time, it's going to become this emphasis on the media is going to become more important, especially by the 80s and 90s and the rise of, for our students, it's and students who may be listening in, it's a very different time when you go from the 70s where you have 3 basic channels that are on, right? And maybe 30 minutes of international news to the rise of CNN in the 80s and 90s when you have 24, now you have 24/7 news channel that still didn't have a lot of ratings. And then by the 90s, where you get to the heady times of Fox, to where we are now, right, in which everything is streamed and it's available at the click. So, and the constant look for some kind of expert to speak about something. The rush for money, foreign money, and what's interesting is one of the things I talk about in the book is you will see this in the 70s in relation to the spike in oil prices. And then the Arab oil boycott in the 70s following the 1973 Arab-Israeli war. And part of this becomes known as not just the recycling of petrodollars, right, into the U.S. through both weapons sales, real estate, but places like Saudi Arabia and others are going to look for ways to improve their image by funding university chairs at places like Arkansas, USC, Harvard, right? That is going to shift from universities, as you can imagine, by the 2000s and post 9/11 to think tanks, where they will be seen as places where you can actually influence policy. Why? Because there's a revolving door between the policy world, those who are working in administrations, and the think tank world. So what you see is now this change. And Brookings was partially responsible for that in the 70s. Its work on not just domestic politics, but then, of course, a major study group on resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict and the peace process, and some key figures we brought into the Carter administration. Which brings us to another think tank some students may be familiar with. So who starts looking at Brookings with envy? So remember, Jimmy Carter defeats Gerald Ford in 76. He comes in, he brings a big group from Brookings with him as it's perceived outside. And the American Enterprise Institute decides and this is deliberate as I talk about in the book, we are going to copy Brookings. And so by the 1980 election, by the next election cycle, AEI is determined to be, for the Republican Party, what they see Brookings as for the Democrats, okay? And then there's a whole change that will go on that I talk about in the book with AEI in the 80s into the 90s, the rise of, for example, the Heritage Foundation and others. But that push for additional funding, what's fascinating about it, and for funding from overseas, you could argue really begins post-Cold War and gets expanded after 9/11. And again, so some of this is about some of the Gulf states attempting to improve their image, attempting to find what they will see as, if not necessarily a lobbying arm, someone that will represent their interests both in Washington and inside administrations and in the media. And so you can see, to your point, by the time of the Trump administration, you do have, because there are so many think tanks and they're all scrambling for a small amount of, similar amount of dollars from key donors, some pretty heady arguments, whether it's about Syria, about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Morsi government, for example, in Egypt, and then, of course, Trump's policies, whether it was maximum pressure on Iran versus the Muslim ban versus should we take sides in this dispute between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, and which side should we take and who gets promoted. Now, what's interesting is there's a whole alignment here that gets beyond kind of the regional dynamics and the regional rivalries, for example, of some of these Gulf states, to where do they sit, for example, vis-a-vis U.S. foreign policy in the region. And what they're broadly looking for is not to overturn U.S. policy in the region. What they want to do is influence it and influence their place within the U.S. regional order. And I think that's one of the things that's often missed when we talk about Arab-occupied territory in the Gulf, is look, Qatar is not saying we want the U.S. out. Qatar has the largest base in the region, hosts the largest American base in the region, right? What did the UAE want? The UAE wanted an American base, and actually they wanted to supplant the base in Qatar for the UAE. And so that was part of this dispute. So they're not talking about overthrowing U.S. foreign policy or kicking the United States out of the region. If anything, they want a deeper involvement, and in part because they see that, remember, these are minority regimes, right? In the case of the UAE, it has a very small population. It's very wealthy. And the vast majority of people who live in the United Arab Emirates are actually expatriates, right? So whether it's from South Asia, migrant laborers from South Asia, or white-collar workers from South Asia, as well as from Europe and the U.S. So you have minority regimes that are very wary of their populations, very wary of their position, both in the regional order and their own domestic place. And so they're constantly looking for additional support from Washington, and they see think tanks as one way to do that, the same way they would see any of the K Street lobbying firms. What I talk about in the book, and to kind of wrap up the answer to this question, because I'm sure there'll be others about it, what I talk about in the book is, quite frankly, how think tanks from the 1970s through the war on terror really aligned themselves with U.S. national security interests, and were seen as a place where you could get impartial expertise. And you could also start to get this revolving door between whether it's State Department or any one of the other key government agencies, back and forth, or defense, into a think tank for a few years and then back for a new administration. And so that's going to become a key piece, not just for the government that wants these impartial experts, but for the experts who want access and want employment in the administrations.
So, staying with that focus, how did the production of knowledge about the Middle East shape the choice to invade Iraq?
No, that's a great question. So on the one hand, I think one way to think about it is the following: is it's not just an initial production of knowledge, that it builds on. One of the things I try and emphasize in the book is that this builds on a century of engagement, all right? And so a century of engagement within the region, but also a century of writing about this region and writing about it in a certain way. And particularly when you look at the works and the scholars that influence policy, particularly by the time we get to 9/11, the war on terror, and then the invasion of Iraq, right? So, for example, the Bush administration is going to rely on several key Middle East scholars as well as think tanks. And so there's going to be this really interesting intersection between two key scholars, one at Princeton, one at Johns Hopkins, Bernard Lewis at Princeton, Fouad Ajami at Johns Hopkins, who will be big on promoting, and this appeals to the Bush administration, a broad reshaping of the region, right? Democracy promotion, as they'll write about it, really at the point of a gun, okay? This appeals to the Bush administration. This appeals to the president himself, who sees this as a chance to what he calls the freedom agenda, right? But there's another piece here that aligns with it, which is the following, which is out of the think tanks, is the construction of Iraq as an imminent threat. Okay. So you're going to have several key people, particularly, and it's going to cross lines. So Brookings Institution, for example, you'll have Kenneth Pollock. Kenneth Pollock had served the National Security Council for Bill Clinton, and that gave him kind of this impartial, at least in appealing to Democrats and especially Democratic hawks, right? At the same time, you have at the American Enterprise Institute, which was closely aligned with the Bush administration, at something like 15 or 18 of its different employees and fellows who served at different levels in the administration. Dick Cheney himself was a board member at AEI. So AEI is fully on board with reshaping the Middle East and doing it initially with Iraq. So the key thing here is now presenting Iraq as a threat. And so one of the things Kenneth Pollock is going to write about in this book he writes, and then a series of op-eds, that very well-timed op-eds that are published in New York Times, Washington Post, and press appearances, is that based on what he saw in the National Security Council, Saddam Hussein was continuing to work on a nuclear weapon. He had a nuclear weapons program, that he had weapons of mass destruction. He had been hiding them, and that the United States really was faced with a difficult choice, but a not so difficult choice, which was, we can fight Saddam Hussein now, or we can fight a nuclear Saddam Hussein tomorrow, right? And why this is important is what he's bringing with him. He's coming out of the Clinton administration. He's at Brookings, so it appeals to kind of mainstream Democrats. It's not from the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, but they themselves have their own experts who are out beating the drum on especially on Fox News, and of course, Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami, who were also serving as experts both inside the administration and then also to the media, and arguing that, yes, the time is right, that the Middle East is desperate for change, right? And that Saddam Hussein's regime will fall at the whiff of gunpowder, and America will be greeted as liberators. In fact, what we now know, and then this is going to tie into more broadly into these ideas of who gets to speak. All right. So while those voices were favored, as I talked about, other Middle East studies scholars reviewed with suspicion, particularly those who were opposed to the war, or who argued this is not going to be as simple as you think. This is a big mistake. This has nothing to do with 9/11. Saddam Hussein's regime is deeply problematic. He is, obviously not a nice guy, kind of thing. But if you overthrow him and you don't have a plan in place to replace him, this is going to be a quagmire. But those voices were dismissed, and were dismissed, quite frankly, in really perfunctory ways. One was that Middle East studies scholars, again, were seen as anti-American, as not being sufficiently patriotic after 9/11, as not supporting an attempt to kind of liberate Iraq from this terrible dictator. And of course, consistently bemoaning American foreign policy, and of course, justifying or kind of basically justifying terrorism was quite frankly one of the frank charges, being in bed with Saddam, justifying terrorism, etc. Now, of course, when this all collapses, that discussion is pushed to the side, right? That we weren't wrong. In fact, you're going to see the construction of another kind of knowledge that comes in, which is to say, we did this for the right reasons, right? But the wrong things happen. And Fawad Ajami is going to again come back to the Dream Palace argument and say, look, we brought this wonderful gift of freedom to the Iraqis, but they were not ready to accept it. And, the blame is not ours. The lack of post-war planning, the lack of, it's key decisions that are made by the Bush administration and local and officials that they put in Iraq that have a dramatic impact. All of that, which was warned about in advance. You don't have a plan for post-invasion. You don't have a plan for what's going to happen to secure the country and to rebuild infrastructure. Your students and those who are watching may not remember that you have two Gulf Wars, right? So you have the first Persian Gulf War, it becomes known as Desert Storm. And then in between, you have a heavy sanctions regime that's put in place on Iraq. And by 2000, 2001, the sanctions regime is crumbling. The only one who's benefiting from the sanctions regime is, quite frankly, Saddam Hussein and his family and key Iraqi elites. The Iraqi public has been devastated. and it's actually served to strengthen his regime. But the infrastructure of Iraq has been heavily damaged, and that's before the bombing begins again and the U.S. invades, and what it does to the infrastructure and what it does to Iraqi society and the open ruptures that then occur. So when we talk about the production of knowledge, it occurs, to come back to your question, at several different levels, because it's not just about op-eds in the New York Times or Washington Post. This also occurs in the daily commentary on the media, so including whether it's Fox News, MSNBC, the talk radio, which become key havens for this. But then also the production of knowledge inside the academy, right? And where are these key centers? Who is supporting the war effort and who is opposed to it? And how are they viewed by policymakers? And which voices get heard in the media and inside the Beltway?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very heady moment in the U.S. foreign policy world, and there was pressure. A lot of people speak to feeling pressure to support the war. I mean, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations spoke of feeling pressure for reasons of professional credibility to support the war, and the degree of the depth to which it penetrated culture is incredible. I believe there was someone dug up some footage of Britney Spears speaking out in favor of the war. I think Ken Pollack was a guest on Oprah at one point. There was incredible reach, an incredible amount of focus on this conflict, and it was a lot of these experts who were the ones who were getting out there.
And I think it's important probably for the students who are watching to understand a couple of things. So when the first Persian Gulf War under President George Herbert Walker Bush, when concerns were raised about the coalition that was being built, and was there a diplomatic solution? Was there another way to force Iraq out of Kuwait, short of a war? A number of Democrats who voted against the war resolution, and the concern that this was going to be a quagmire, were embarrassed, right? So, for example, Joe Biden, right? Then Senator Joe Biden is one. You'll have a John Kerry is another. You'll have several key senators, Bill Bradley of New Jersey at the time, who come out against the war, right? And of course, what ends up happening is this scuttles their chances to run against Bush in 92. Bush, obviously the U.S. wins the conflict, but Saddam Hussein stays in power, right? So Iraq is liberated. Saddam Hussein stays in power. Sanctions regime is imposed. No-fly zones are imposed. But those Democrats are damaged, or the perception that they're damaged. And it looks like Bush is unbeatable. If you remember, 81% approval rating. It looks like he's just going to skate to re-election. And then, of course, deep economic recession, real problems. Kind of the post-Cold War hangover comes in, the post-Gulf War hangover. And the United States goes into a deep economic recession, really in late 91 into 92. And the rise of a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, and who wins but Bill Clinton, right? Who was never expected to win or to beat George Bush. So some of that hangs over some of the debate among Democrats. Should we support the war? Should we not? Right? We thought it was going to be a quagmire before, and it wasn't. And so this time you're going to see a different kind of political discourse. But 9/11 plays a key role. Could the war have happened without 9/11? One of the things historians have gone back and forth on is whether or not, and we're limited in this because we don't have the archives. We have snippets of knowledge from administration officials. How much planning was there to invade Iraq by the Bush administration before 9/11? Were there discussions? What was the belief? And I think I'll go out on the limb and say I think it was going to be very difficult for George Bush, who did not win the 2000 election. Right, voting the counts are stopped in Florida. He comes in under this cloud of the election. It's a delayed, process of getting in. It impacts the transition, et cetera. It would have been questionable, I think. There had been attempts in the 90s during Clinton's second term, perhaps to try regime change with Iraq. It created hackles among the Democratic Party base. This was not popular. The belief was we have many other problems at home we need to focus on. we're not going to go, how are you going to go invade the country again, build up and invade the country again? What replaces Saddam, right? So all of this is kind of feeding that discourse. And then you have 9/11. And I think one of the challenges, I think, for students to understand is that the Bush administration, again, back to the production of knowledge, did a very deliberate job of muddying the waters on 9/11. And of course, building up this case. We talk about the production of knowledge, building up this case through innuendo, often through just outright lies, right? That there was a relationship between Saddam Hussein and bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And it turned out, including, have Cheney saying this on major news programs, Meet the Press, et cetera, hinting at it through journalists who were allied with the administration. The now infamous, for the students who don't know, defector, who's was codenamed Curveball, turned out manufactured almost all of his claims about the regime and its connections to bin Laden. But that was readily promoted through major media outlets, including the New York Times, and it was promoted as fact. And lo and behold, it turns out that no, he was from a CIA-funded opposition group, the Iraqi National Congress, which was supposed to be, for students who don't know, the government in waiting and the government in exile. That really never becomes the government in exile. So when we talk about knowledge production, I think what's so challenging is how experts who really knew about Iraq, who had spent time in Iraq, and who had written about Iraq, were sidelined. And those who had this imagination about Iraq were the ones who were promoted and what could occur, right? And then, of course, what do you do as a historian when, quite frankly, knowledge is just being manufactured? It's just being created. So that was it. What's interesting for me is, and I'll tell a personal story real quick before we go on to the next question. It was that manufacturing of knowledge, right? The curveball, the fake intelligence reports, the claims about Saddam Hussein looking for uranium in parts of East Africa. And what it got me thinking as a graduate student at the time was, well, if they're manufacturing this, what else has been manufactured, right? And so part of this was about, the book really started, quite frankly, it would start as a dissertation with the invasion of Iraq. I mean, so I started with the end of the book, and that's so, and then teasing it back. So it's funny how these things develop for students who are interested in, like, okay, well, where did you get the actual kernel of the idea? And it really started out of kind of that and another conversation about, well, what is the Middle East? How did this idea come about, right? Where did this name come from and how did it develop? And those two came together in what became this book. And so, but part of it was, quite frankly, it grew out of the war in Iraq and about the exact period you're talking about and the pressure to support the war.
Yeah, I'm curious. A few things you mentioned there. It reminds me very much of some of the scholarship on the intelligence community, how it had a similar experience with the Persian Gulf War, where they had said, I think basically that, Saddam doesn't have, an advanced WMD program. And then in the post-war period, they discover, actually he did. We got this really wrong and we underestimated it. And that, I think, shapes, their willingness to accommodate, some of the folks who wanted to kind of amplify some of the crazier parts of the intelligence, because like the German intelligence had worked with Curveball and doubted him a lot, were basically right. But at the same time, like, there was also an effort within the Bush administration to amplify intelligence beyond what the intelligence community was finding. They had kind of like separate channels that they were using, the vice president's office, et cetera. I think this kind of raises a question that I had, because like the neoconservative movement, is a big part of this story. And they're, some of the most enthusiastic champions of the Iraq War, of course. They're also some of the most enthusiastic combatants against a lot of these area study scholars, against Edward Said, et cetera. But the way they perceive themselves operating in Washington, is that they are the outsiders, that they're like, okay, we're fighting against an establishment that is not hawkish enough, that doesn't really get it. They're the ones who had the Team B exercise, saying like the Soviets are way more powerful than we thought. they set up these separate offices within the Bush administration to promote kind of the most dramatic intelligence because they didn't trust the intelligence community to get it all out there because they're like, this is a bunch of Democrats who graduated from Yale who absorbed that environment and don't get like the real dangers to America. And even today, I've heard people in that community say, the blob was what was promoting the Iran deal, and it was us opponents of the Iran deal who were fighting the establishment. So they see themselves as an anti-establishment, but we're also kind of talking here about how they're operating at the heart of it and manufacturing this knowledge. I'm curious if you've got thoughts here.
So what's great about your question, and I want to tease it out into two ways. So one is because I talk a little about this in the book, right? One of the things I talked about some of the polemical works on Middle East studies, and one of the more outrageous claims is, quite frankly, to blame Middle East studies scholars for 9/11. Okay, is to say and blame Edward Said at Columbia and John Esposito at Georgetown as being responsible. And why are they responsible? So the claim will be it's because of Said and because of his hegemonic dominance in area studies and Middle East studies. And this focus on Orientalism that in Middle East studies scholars missed the ball on Islamic, what they would call Islamic fundamentalism, jihadism, etc. And John Esposito at Georgetown has taught us that Islam is a religion of peace and promotes Islam as a religion of peace. And we now know Islam is a religion of violence. Look at this terrible violence that was unleashed by Islam broadly conceived, right? Not the hijackers, not bin Laden. It's Islam, right? A global religion of 1 billion people. Okay. So, part of the book was also kind of like the visceral reaction to that initially, the dissertation and the book. But more broadly, you've hit on a real point, which is a reason why I bring this up. One of the things I say in the book is kind of like, look, Middle East studies scholars cannot match. They're not intelligence agencies, and they're not intelligence agents, right? If the United States, with this vast intelligence operation, could not prevent 9/11, right? There's very little that me as a Middle East studies scholar was going to be able to do, right? Okay, it's ridiculous to suggest this, right? So let me throw that out there and then take a step back, which is because I think what you've hit on is the trepidation within the intelligence community. And we've seen this multiple times, whether it's Pearl Harbor, okay, the failure to predict Pearl Harbor or to prevent it, the Soviet A-bomb test, right? Which, for those students who don't know, when the Soviets get the A-bomb, it's 5 to 10 years ahead of what the U.S. is projecting, and it becomes a huge embarrassment, right? There are other key examples throughout the Cold War, and then you get, of course, to the 9/11 moment, or even before that, the Persian Gulf War, which is like, well, we didn't think he had these weapons, and now we're embarrassed, and this, of course, makes us look bad. So now we've got to be more conservative in our estimates, and it empowers, quite frankly, critics of the intelligence agency, often from the right, who say, okay, your issue is this is what you would hear. So, like the book, for example, also challenges the notion of what's known as the Arabist in the State Department, right? Those State Department individuals who, often children of missionaries, grew up in the region, know Arabic fluently, end up working for the State Department, and are seen as kind of too friendly to the Arab side, right? They, as I talk about it, you'll see some that are described as, well, he speaks like an Arab and he thinks like an Arab, whatever that means, right? That's actually a phrase you'll see said about one of these key people, William Eddy. Okay. And then you'll see that also about the intelligence community, that there'll be this criticism of the intelligence community that, they're too conservative, right? They're Democrats who went to Yale, who, really, they voted for Gore and they just want to embarrass the administration, right? And this kind of thing. And what's interesting is and so this takes us to the second part of your question, which is about the neoconservative movement. So the neoconservative movement, you're absolutely right. I think what students don't realize is what's the origin point for the neoconservatives. And this is where, it was a great part of the book for me, was talking about the Vietnam War as this interesting split, right? So the new left movement emerges on campuses out of the civil rights movement. These were campus protesters who went on the freedom buses, right? So one of the first things they do is they're challenging segregation. And they're challenging segregation in the South and in the West. They go back to their college campuses, and then they begin organizing to challenge segregation more broadly, right, on college campuses. Many of them will then become part of what becomes known as Students for a Democratic Society, and then we'll begin challenging the Vietnam War. Okay, here's where the rupture point becomes. So they're challenging the Vietnam War, and that's all well and good. And then the rupture point becomes around the June 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And so when you have some elements of what becomes known as the New Left, many of whom were then, undergraduates or graduate students, start to say, well, what is our foreign policy in the Middle East? And what is our foreign policy within Israel? So we're fighting one war in Vietnam. And there are those who will end up becoming neoconservatives who say, no, we should stand with Israel. Israel standing against Soviet allies, Soviet allies, particularly Egypt and Syria. And those who argue, no, the U.S., the U.S. needs to rethink its U.S. foreign policy, particularly vis-a-vis the Palestinians and Israel. Okay. And do Palestinians have a right to self-determination, et cetera? So you're going to have this split within the New Left movement. And it's really going to come to a head in the 72 election over McGovern. And so those won because, of what McGovern wanting to end the war more quickly than Nixon, who is withdrawing troops from Vietnam, but is still, it's this combination of withdrawal and escalation. And we're going to start to see that split. And those, what will become the neocons, will leave over criticism of Israel and, of course, what they see as the inept handling of the Vietnam War, okay, and the McGovern candidacy, and they will go full-on Republican by 1980 with the Reagan presidency. And in between, to your point, they're going to try and influence the Carter administration. They won't have a lot of influence. They'll be shut out of the Carter administration, but they will go full on for Reagan in 80 and 84, and then on for Bush by 88. But they're always going to have, and I think you're right, John, that they're always going to have this idea that they are the outsiders, right? That they are, and it's kind of part of that plucky persona. Even at the height of neocon influence in the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration and the war on terror, they will deny that they have influence. They will claim, we are not as influential as you claim. We don't have that. And yet they'll say that, and then they'll also be the ones promoting the U.S. as an empire to reshape not just the Middle East, but the world and America's image. And it's their image of America, right? It's the policies they want. Absolute military dominance and military primacy, neoliberal economics, and a version of human rights that kind of distinguishes our friends from our opponents, right? And these are just some aspects of it. You could also argue that the neoconservatives are not just responsible for the debacle in Iraq, but the situation in Syria next door, which was often seen as this is the next step. We're going to take out Iraq, then we'll take out Syria, and then Iran will either be second or third on the list. But that's just very quickly going to be, a dominoes tumbling effect. But with the U.S. tumbling the dominoes, right? So, for example, students may not realize this, but there's some evidence. We have some evidence that, for example, the Iranian government reaches out to the Bush administration after Saddam Hussein falls and says, we're ready to talk, and we're ready to make some major concessions. Much of what you're seeing now, and you could see this link now when we talk about kind of going back to the nuclear deal. Some of the things that were demanded by Trump, for example, abandoning the missile program, abandoning groups like Hezbollah, support for Hezbollah or Hamas, that the Iranians were willing to discuss without preconditions, right? And it was neoconservatives in the Bush administration who said, particularly Vice President Cheney, no, there's nothing to talk about. Basically you're next. And here we are. And in fact, so, one of the implications of the quagmire in Iraq is that it's not going to be the United States that has influence in Iraq after Saddam Hussein falls. It's going to be Iran, right? And so you can see the implications of that, of some of those decisions and repeated decisions that then we're still dealing with today.
Yeah, so we've got a little bit of time left. And I guess one of the questions I would have, we've got a lot of folks in our audience who want to, enter and shape the policy debate in Washington. And we've just had this long critique of a lot of the institutions in Washington and of think tanks. But if you're, I always talk to folks about the term realpolitik. It's an original construction, was a German idealist liberal who saw the 1848 revolutions fail and is like, how can I bring my ideas into effect, right, while recognizing the existing status and power that exists, that's already in place? Like, what should people be taking away in terms of action from this? Like, if you're a young person trying to come and influence policy in Washington, and this is the environment that you're entering, and you can't flip a switch and suddenly policy is made differently.
Right.
How do you approach that?
I think you've hit on part of it, which is to have, again, realistic expectations, right? That these are longstanding institutions, that they are powerful institutions, that you can play a key role within them, and still run up against real institutional pressures, biases. And so part of it's about, I think, the first thing is to think about what it is you want to achieve, right? What is possible? What is it you want to achieve? And understanding more about kind of the history of these institutions, what they do well, what they don't do well, and what your role can be within them. So I think that's paramount, right? I think going in with eyes wide open is always, I think one of the things is, we have this view, and part of it is, the students who are watching may not get this reference, but I'm sure you will, John. There's a West Wing approach, right? And this idea that this is how policy is made, this is how administrations run, that it's, it's just the quick, fast walk and talk and bluster in the White House. And that's, we're going to tell the Iranians this, and then they're going to do it, and it's those kind of, I think, knee jerk, for lack of a better term, approaches to policy that have helped get us to the point we're in now, right? And so I think one of the challenges even today, and I think we're seeing this, we see this across public policy schools, is one of the implications, if you think about from the war on terror, the 2008 financial crisis, and really some of the implications from the Trump presidency, is government is no longer held in high esteem. You've heard this over and over again, and government service is not held in high esteem. Domestic politics have become almost toxic, right? We've gone beyond the point where they were contentious to they're now nearly toxic. And it's not just about January 6th, and we've seen that, for example, in the response to COVID, and the failure to address climate change, right? Domestic politics have become almost absolutely toxic. So you can almost understand the opposite of students who are saying, I don't want anything to do with it. Actually, I want to go work in the tech sector, right? I don't want to work in, why am I going to go do this? And I have students, who will come and ask for advice. And the biggest advice I give them is just eyes wide open, and know exactly, I try not to paint a broad brush in the book towards think tanks or towards any of the government agencies. What I do try and do is get students to understand that there's the West Wing view of this, right? And the view you may take from popular culture about what a think tank does. And then there's also the reality of it. And so I think part of trying to get students to understand, what does it mean to work in the Foreign Service? What will you be doing day to day? What is it like to rise through the ranks? What does it mean to work for a think tank, right? What do think tanks actually do? So those, I think, if there's a lesson to take away from the book, it's about humility, about the humility that should accompany expertise that often doesn't, right? And so I think that's probably the biggest takeaway I would give students is do this, but do this humbly, right? And that's, I think, probably one of the things to think about.
Yeah, well, and just maybe one closing question. I don't want to open up too big of a can of worms here, but this very early generation of Middle Eastern expertise is very interesting. You talk about Orientalist scholars and missionaries, children of missionaries, et cetera. And then also something I was thinking about is like, there are people who immigrate from the Middle East into the United States even before the period in the book. There's right. People coming over in the 1880s from Syria, Armenia, Lebanon, et cetera. And so they're bringing, this kind of organic knowledge. And, if you're like a missionary that spent a lot of time over there, you're again bringing like a deep knowledge of the culture.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like what was kind of the vision that folks coming from that context were trying to advance? Like, how does that differ? Because you talk about area studies and the think takers and their kind of image. Right. What's the image coming from those communities?
Well, so I think what's interesting, and this is one of the things I touch on in the book, right, which is when you look at the role, for example, it's why the World War I chapter is interesting to me. I had hoped to do an earlier chapter that touches on the period you're talking about. So even kind of bleeding into World War I and the rise of the American Oriental Society. So the oldest learned society in the United States is the American Oriental Society. And again, covering this broad Orient from West Africa all the way to Japan. So part of it is, and there are some books that are a little more favorable towards the missionaries. I'm a little tough on the missionaries in a couple of different ways. One, because I actually look at what they wrote. Okay. So, and one of the challenges is that they do have this derogatory view of the region, the people there. They have a civilizing mission. At Versailles, the president of what becomes the American University of Beirut is going to try and convince Wilson that, the people there, they're kind but childlike. They need a guiding hand, right? So this is, that in of itself tells you kind of there's a paternalistic notion of how the missionaries viewed the population they were interacting with. One of the challenges is, John, quite frankly, they don't even speak the language. So we have this idea that they speak the language. Many of them who first go there, and it's going to take time, don't even speak the language. So it's one of the reasons why attempts at conversion fail in the mid 19th century, right? As you can imagine, well, think about, they're taking the model that they used in the American West, right? Which they go west, they don't speak, the local Native American languages. And so basically it is a process of teaching them English so that they can then effectively read the Bible or some kind of phonetic version of the Bible. Christianizing, quote unquote, civilizing and Christianizing. And they take that same idea from the American West, whether it is to the Near East, to China, to India, et cetera. And of course, it doesn't go well initially. And then there's the second, what becomes known as the second wave, where they're establishing hospitals and schools, et cetera, where they're taking on more of a more humble but still paternalistic approach to the region. And some of that comes out in the writing and in their engagement, especially when it comes to dealing with a policymaker. So one of Wilson's bases of support is the American missionary movement, right? So that's one of the key things that, when they have access to him, they're actually pushing for a greater American role in the Middle East and reshaping the Middle East and America's image. That's going to change over time, but again, there's a lot of consistency, right? Especially as I get to World War II, because that's who the precursor to the CIA is going to call on. There are a number of American missionaries, a number of American academics who are sent to be the Lawrence, as I talk about, of their generation, right? One of the things I want to hit on, though, is this, because you touched on this, and I think this is a really important point. So I talk about this group called the Inquiry during World War I. So Woodrow Wilson puts them together. They're supposed to be this impartial band of experts that he brings in. And for the Middle East region, none of them have expertise in the region, almost none. There's maybe one guy, right? And so it's fascinating that it's not even called the Middle East at that point, it's called Western Asia. But because that group of the Inquiry, who then many of them will accompany, and that includes, for example, Isaiah Bowman of the American Geological Society, who comes back in World War II and does some other work for the government. But several others. Walter Lippmann, one of the most famous columnists of the 20th century, especially the Cold War, is a very young, progressive scholar at the time and progressive writer, will be a key player in the Inquiry. They're going to go with Wilson. And they're so dismayed by the final peace at Versailles that one of the things that will inspire them is when they come home, Bowman will become one of the key figures to found the Council on Foreign Relations. And the idea is we want to create an impartial group of experts that can advise policymakers so a disaster like Versailles doesn't happen again, right? And so it's kind of preventing what happened at Versailles. And so there you see kind of the origin points of the CFR. And so, for example, one of the points I try and make in the book is I'm not saying that the Inquiry was as influential as think tanks are later, but it is really what if you had asked Isaiah Bowman what he hoped for, at the end of World War, coming back from Versailles, and the failure of the inquiry's dream of reshaping the world. Think tanks are what he would have wanted. A place like Brookings is exactly, and the Council on Foreign Relations is exactly what he was hoping for. Okay.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have. Thank you to Professor Osama Khalil for taking the time to speak to us about the origins of American Middle East expertise. So thank you all for attending. Thank you to Dr. Khalil, and everybody have a wonderful evening.